All right, thank you so much, Amy, and welcome to everybody. I hope that you can hear me okay. I've done this enough times with teaching, but every platform is slightly different. So again, my name is Beth Humbert. I am a professor in the management department of the Manning School of Business at UMass Lowell. I've been there since 2014, where I not only teach our business school students, but also do research and academic writing and some consulting. And one of my areas of expertise is around gender and work and studying women's careers and work-life issues. And so, you know, one of the joys of being a scholar in a certain area and having an area of expertise is when your area of expertise is relevant to something in the public conversation. And so it's been a bit of a catch-22, not just for myself, for a host of my colleagues and research collaborators that do work in this area, where we certainly are able to help talk about what we're seeing with respect to women in work during the pandemic and beyond. At the same time, it is, you know, it's been some difficult information to report on, as you'll see here, and I'm sure that many people attending have already read about. That, you know, the pandemic has created some additional challenges and unique dynamics for what we had seen with respect to progress made for women and work. The other piece is when I used to work in corporate world and finance and industry prior to going back and getting my PhD and becoming a professor. And I remember being taught in my doctoral studies that often the areas that we choose to research could very affectionately be called me search, because we tend to want to study and understand and explain and potentially change things that are relevant to us in our own work life. And so that is no more true than what I am going to share with you today around some of the issues that many of us are facing with respect to our professional lives and managing our family and our children. I have 2 young children, and we are doing our best making our way through this, as we all are. So I am happy to be here. Thank you to the Better Business Bureau for asking me to provide this webinar. I actually delivered a similar series the end of last year for the Innovation Hub up at UMass Lowell. And so this is largely similar to that. So if anybody also attended that, you're welcome to listen again. I've updated some of the statistics from what we've seen since then, but this is largely a similar discussion. And so with that, I wanted to start with a little bit of a unique beginning to a presentation, just to kind of set the stage for what we're going to cover today. She left her 20-year career in order to manage children's remote learning. She pared back to part-time so she could provide more help to her aging parents during a pandemic. She turned down extra hours at her retail job because she couldn't find the usual after-school care for her children. She said yes to the promotion because now it didn't involve as much travel. She made it to that late afternoon meeting this time because now her work from home partner could tend to the children. She finally pursued her passion of opening a clothing boutique because her day job now offered more flexibility. And so I don't usually get this dramatic when I'm offering business presentations, but I often say, you know, the names and places have been changed to protect the innocent, whatever the words are, but we all have heard these stories, whether it's us, whether it's a family member, a colleague, a friend, a partner, that as we've kind of navigated these past 10 months, there's certainly been a host of challenges, but also we're starting to see a little bit of some opportunities as well. And so as we talk about women in work during the pandemic and beyond, some of this is definitely hard to swallow. If you've read any of the headlines, a lot of it won't be surprising, but I hope that what we can do is leave here today also feeling like amidst these challenges, we see some opportunities that we collectively can all be a part of, ensuring that we realize those opportunities for women in work as we move through this, you know, hopefully rounding the end of this pandemic period over the next 6 months. And so that's really what the goals are for this webinar. to just have a discussion and really understand the complex context that's facing women's careers today. And a lot of that context existed prior to the pandemic, but is kind of being compounded in unique ways because of what's happening right now. And also to be able to recognize some of those potential silver linings and opportunities that I just kind of teed up a little bit with those quick short stories. And I do also hope that everybody will leave with a takeaway that can be relevant to their own career, to their organization, whether they're a manager or a leader themselves. A couple caveats before I dive in. Obviously, talking about anything as it relates to gender and gender in organizations is very complex, right? Nothing that we could really cover and do full justice to in an hour, never mind even maybe a full semester course. And so recognize that, you know, there is a lot of diversity even among the context of women. We have women that, you know, are in more secure professional positions, women that are essential workers. We have hourly workers, salary workers, people from different racial and socioeconomic backgrounds. And so in the 45 minutes that I have here today, we certainly probably won't do justice to all of those nuances and differences within the demographic of women. But we will try to start to understand what this context looks like at a higher level and really be more attuned to what some of those differences may be within that. Also caveat being that, yes, we are talking about the challenges facing women in their careers today, but we know everybody is facing impacts right now, men and women, people with children, people without, people with young children, people with older children, single folk, grandparents. So this is not to say that women are only facing challenges, but that is going to be our focus today. Again, not a single story. We know there's a lot of variance within even the demographic of women. And then lastly, I sometimes forget this because I'm so steeped in these conversations from an academic and research standpoint. But when we're talking about women sort of as a group, we're really not talking about an individual woman. So I may describe some of the expectations and roles and things that we have for, you know, men and women. And that's really at a aggregated level. These are really patterns that we see. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it characterizes any individual household specifically, but more so on the aggregate. This is what we see when we look at comparisons of women's professional experiences and the statistics that support that as compared to men. And then as Amy mentioned at the beginning, and for folks that may be just joining, certainly feel free to drop any questions that come up into the chat, and we will cover those at the end. So first, as I mentioned, let's set the stage of kind of where women's careers were even prior to this pandemic period. And some of this may be familiar to you, some may not. So I'm going to just briefly share some high-level kind of statistics and trends. So what we've seen over the past 4 or 5 decades is that women's participation in the labor force has steadily increased, even during economic downturn. So what that means is the active labor force, working people, we've seen the share of women in that workforce increase over time. Okay? And as a percentage of that workforce, women have begun to be more equal participants to men over time. And you'll see in this graph here that was projected to continue, that some estimates are suggesting over the next 5 to 10 years, we would see equal 50% of women participating in the labor force as compared to men. Now, obviously, this doesn't account for the level of salary or the level that they're participating in. This is just strictly, if we look at who is participating in the workforce, we were over time moving to a point that relatively becoming equal between men and women's participation in that workforce overall. And then thirdly, within that, the proportion of female breadwinners was also increasing. So what does that mean? If we look at this graph here, certainly at an aggregated level, men still tend to make more money, earn more than female counterparts, but the relative percentage of that was increasing, whereby in more recent years, we were seeing more situations where women were out-earning their male partners. So that's all great news, right? Women's labor force participation was increasing steadily. The share of the labor force held by women as compared to men also increasing, and the proportion of female breadwinners was up. And so I know we have a couple of my former students on here. You know that I like to say this all the time when we explain things in such a simple fashion, like, this is great, right? This is all good news. We've solved all the world's problems and everything was looking well and good. Sort of, right? So certainly we're still kind of talking pre-pandemic. yes, we cannot argue that over the past 50 years, if we took what the status of women in work was 50 years ago as compared to pre-pandemic, 10 months ago, there was certainly progress, but that's not to say that there were not still remaining challenges. In fact, there were many remaining challenges. And one is that we know it's really hard to change what we have as sort of gendered expectations, the roles that we expect men and women to play. And so by and large, we really still expected, even in the context of these shifts, that women are associated with household and family care and men are associated with paid work outside the home. Now, remember, as I gave it the caveat at the beginning, we're talking about aggregated general patterns and expectations here. We were seeing that men were taking on more household labor and childcare than ever before. There's a lot of time use studies done by Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example, that shows over time, men have certainly become more involved in caregiving and household work. However, by and large, it still fell to women largely to take on what some sociologists call the second shift. So even if we have a dual career couple where both folks work, largely we see that women were still spending more time on that second shift of household and family care. Compounding that, or not surprisingly as part of that, organizations still largely operate based on what we call ideal worker norms. The ideal worker is that person that can come into the office, that can do their job from 9 to 5, fully focused on their work without any obligations or distractions from their home or family life encroaching on that work world. And we know that that's simply not the case. That's not the case for men or women really today, but largely organizations and the way we expect workers to show up and how long they're there and how we compensate them, we're still based on these kind of entrenched ideal worker norms that assumed that families were structured such that one person worked outside the home and one person was responsible for maintaining the household. And the fact of the matter is only about a quarter of family structures in the United States still fit that traditional model. We know this. We have single family households. We have many dual career households, lots of different family structures. Yet what a lot of us that are studying and have studied how organizations can be more family supportive, this is one of the things we've been, continually pushing for, that we haven't updated our expectations for workers to really align with what we know is no longer a traditional family structure. And so what happens then, and what was happening and still happening prior to the pandemic, is that when this all became too much for a family to manage and there needed to be decisions made within a family unit around whose career was going to take priority and who was maybe going to pare back their hours or scale back their work in order to make this whole family be able to run, it largely still became an economic decision. And we know that at a high level, men tend to still earn more than women. And therefore, when a family was faced with some sort of decision around who can pick up this extra slack, it largely would fall to the women. And so even though we see all this progress over time that I just showed you in these graphs and figures, it still was largely the case that when families needed to make a decision about who was going to, pare back in their career, it largely still was women doing that. And so this picture here is sometimes how I know I have felt, and maybe many of you have felt. What was crucial to making this whole dance and balance work were a lot of support structures that were available to help families hold this together. Things like childcare and schools and after school care and family members that could help. It was really what's allowed us to see that progress that I just showed you in those graphs to happen, even though we know that a lot of these expectations and organizational norms still were not very amenable to having two household members out of the house working. Okay, and so that's really what the setting was prior to the pandemic. We've seen progress made for women over the last 50 years, but there certainly were some big messy challenges that remained. And so enter what has been affectionately dubbed She-Session 2020, and I'll explain in a minute where that term comes from. But I'm pretty sure probably most all of you that are here today have read these largely depressing headlines that are continuing to come out about the way in which the pandemic has taken a toll on all of this progress that we had seen made. And so we're going to dive in now to a little bit of why that is the case. And so this term She-Session which I've now added to say we probably are unfortunately calling it recession 2020-2021 at this point, is really being used to characterize that this particular recession that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on women's employment. And that's notable because if you're familiar with any of the past recessions, particularly the financial collapse, 2008, 2009, the Great Recession, and even the Great Depression to an extent, but the workforce situation was different then. But largely recessions have tended actually to disproportionately impact industries like manufacturing and construction, which are industries that have more men employed in them. And so this is a unique situation in this recession where we're actually seeing it have a disproportionate impact on women's employment. And that's driven by a number of factors. One being that the nature of this pandemic made it such that the sectors that were hit hardest by unemployment early on, and even still in this recession, are those that were disproportionately dominated by women. So we largely still have a segregated workforce in many industries. And so if you think of industries like retail, certain parts of healthcare, leisure and hospitality, education, these are industries that were definitely hit hardest by unemployment when we had early lockdowns and the early uncertainty around how the pandemic was spreading. And these also happen to be industries that where women make up more of the workforce. So women are still overrepresented in the service and retail jobs that largely vanished at the beginning of this recession and pandemic. And then the second blow came when, as part of that, we saw a lot of these support systems that I just mentioned around childcare and school and aftercare and summer camps really collapse. And we'll talk about how that's really interconnected in a minute, but that brought this sort of second blow to women's employment. And so what happens in times of crisis is that existing inequities just compound further. And so if you recall the trends I just showed, yes, women have made progress, but there was still some inequities remaining. And sadly, what's happened is in the context of this recession and its disproportionate impact on female-dominated industries, on care and support systems, we've really seen those remaining inequities just exacerbate further. And we're seeing these really concerning declines in progress. And so this is where I'm really going to depress you for a minute. Let me update some of those graphs that I just showed you. The share of women in the workforce now is down to levels they are saying that we have not seen since 1988. So in a matter of months, the progress that I was able to show you in those initial graphs has largely disappeared. Some of the statistics that were most jarring were the month of September, where more than 850,000 women left the workforce in September alone. And you can see in the graph here, comparing that to men in the lighter color. In addition, we know that women have left voluntarily. The women that have voluntarily left the workforce tend to be those with younger children. And in addition to those that have left, a number are still considering downshifting and continuing to pare back their hours. One thing that's interesting to think about that I reported on in a piece with NPR Marketplace a couple months ago is that there's something that economics and employment trends look at called the voluntary quits rate. And so this is really a rate of understanding how many people are voluntarily leaving the workforce or leaving their job. And in good economic times, actually this voluntary quits rate is supposed to be a strong indicator of the employment market. Because if you think about it, if people are voluntarily leaving a career or job, it means they have some confidence that they would be able to re-enter the workforce when they need to. What's happened here is this is flipped. This voluntary quits rate in the last few months has not been an indicator at all of confidence in the economy or the employment market, but rather it has been driven by those factors that we just said, that people are leaving, women largely are leaving the workforce because all of those support systems that allowed dual working families to survive have gone away. And so that voluntary quits rate is very high right now, and it is no longer seen as a strong indicator of the economy and the employment market. And even more so, when we look further at these numbers of women's employment that's impacted, it is impacting non-white women even more so. So again, we see that existing racial and economic inequalities are worsening. And some of the recent data that came out, if you just saw the CNN reported on some of the recent data that came out, whereby women accounted for all of the job losses in December. But if you actually pair that out, some of the statistics suggest that white women actually gained in employment, and all of those losses were entirely felt by Black and Latino women. And so this idea that times of crisis exacerbate existing inequalities, we're not just talking about inequalities between men and women as it relates to employment, but also within the demographic of women, the inequalities between women based on race have also compounded. And so we have clearly got some big, messy challenges here. I've been using this image of the game of Jenga, which I should say I assumed everybody was aware of, although I had a colleague from an older generation than mine recently told me that he had never heard of the game of Jenga. So if you have not, what you have here is this tower of blocks, and the game is to try to pull out a block without having the entire tower collapse. And what I'm using that as an analogy for is that many of us who've studied these things for a long time know that our systems of employment and childcare and healthcare and elder care and the economy are all intricately connected, but I'm not sure that we really understood how interdependent they all were. We kind of took for granted the connections between these systems, and what we're seeing now is when one block gets pulled out, one of those systems gets disrupted. What's relevant here is, you know, the childcare and school and supportive structures that allowed women to be employed. That's pulled out, and we're seeing all of this collapse, right? Or you could say that the public health block has been disrupted by the pandemic and everything else has gone by the wayside. So we're really seeing how connected these systems are, and sadly how much recovering is going to require changes and support around all of those systems. The second piece is, for better or worse, we know that we have some larger, larger things on the docket that we need to attend to in this country by way of paid leave and universal childcare and healthcare. And while folks may disagree on the policies that are needed to get us there, we can all agree that without some larger policy, all we're left with in the near term is organizations providing support to workers that are going to allow us to manage in the medium term. And that's what folks like myself try to understand and study. What can our organizations do to better support working families prior to the pandemic? But now we've got an even larger onus on organizations to try to help us find our way through this mess until we can get a sense more largely in this country of how to manage things like paid leave and universal childcare and the like. There was a really good quote in a recent Harvard Business Review article that acknowledged just this, and it said, you know, widespread structural supports such as parental leave and affordable daycare are absolutely essential, and we know we're lagging on those in this country. But right now, we need a lot more immediate than figuring out these things that we still haven't figured out. So this isn't to say that we're not going to keep the ideal of those as a goal. But in the meantime, we're left with organizations supporting their workers in ways that are going to allow us to kind of thread the needle and get ourselves back up and running. And then the last part of this big, messy challenge is that this recession is different in a way that makes it hard for us to predict how employment is going to look as the pandemic recovers. So largely recessions are driven by structural issues with the economy that then impact individuals' behavior, right? And so you can think of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, and the financial collapse as a good example of that. Structural issues in the economy then led to behavior change. Here we have the flip. By and large, on all accounts, the economy's structure was pretty sound when this pandemic emerged. But what's happened is the pandemic really shifted and made behavior changes necessary. And it's those behavior changes in terms of if and when people can safely shop, if and when people can safely go to work, et cetera, that is really the unknown here. And so we just don't have a blueprint for how the economy and the employment market is going to recover because of what initiated this recession as being so different. And so for those of you, I know I have a few folks on here that are from UMass Lowell. This is our mascot, Rowdy. And he's wondering probably what a lot of you are wondering right now, because if you were with me from the beginning, I know a few of you have joined more recently, but we talked about looking for some silver linings in the context of challenges that are facing women's careers. So now that I've really depressed all of us, and myself included, we're going to turn to try to see, you know, what can be some of the good that comes of this. And by this, I mean that we're faced with a situation largely where right now, a lot of the progress that has been made around women's professional advancement is declining. And we've got these big, messy challenges. And so how can we collectively ensure that we're using this time to create some of the positive changes that we know in the long term will allow us to sustain and regain some of that progress for women as it relates to work? And the first is that we've really ripped the Band-Aid off as it relates to flexible and remote work. So what do I mean by that? So one of the things that even prior to the pandemic that we knew we needed more of was an understanding in organizations of how we could support workers in a more flexible fashion, that we could kind of break down that ideal worker image that I talked about earlier, where we expected that everybody could come into work from 9 to 5 and be at their desk, and those that were there the longest were the best performers. We know that wasn't the best way to be operating. And we saw a lot of companies that were figuring it out, that were offering more flexible work arrangements, either formally or informally to employees. But by and large, it was still seen as something that was temporary or that would allow a working parent to kind of make it through a few years. And what we're now seeing is we really ripped this Band-Aid off. Amy was mentioning it at the beginning about how quickly we all made this swift move to remote, geographically dispersed work. And what I've heard from a lot of managers is we are able to do things in this remote environment that we just never thought we could do, right? It's this bias of we've always done it this way. And so it wasn't that nobody wanted to figure it out, but a lot of people just never felt like there was a way to do our type of business in a remote environment. And what this initial closure in March and April forced organizations to do was to figure it out. Now, I'm not somebody that hopes that we stay 100% virtual and remote forever. I think we're going to need to find an equilibrium and get our offices back up and running when we can do so safely. And that's a whole other talk around the benefits that we have from being physically located in an organization. But I think what this has done is it's allowed nearly every organization that can work remotely, right? This is different, obviously, from essential workers, to see that we can do more flexibly and remotely than we ever thought before. And so the goal is going to be, how do we retain that, right? How do we remember all that we learned about how we can do our work more flexibly and fold that into our everyday work? The second good that I can see coming of this has to relate to women's career transitions, or really any employee's career transition. But I say women because a lot of what we spent time doing when women had to kind of, we call them on-ramps and off-roads in their career, maybe take some time out of their career for child rearing or to care for an older family member, there was a lot of advice out there for, well, how to frame your resume and your cover letter when you're trying to re-enter the workforce. You got to tell a good story. You got to be able to explain why you didn't lose your skills and your advancement when you had to, leave your career for 5 years to care for your young children. And I think what we're seeing now is a couple things. One, we've been jokingly calling it the COVID clause on a resume. Nobody that has a break in their career during this time period is going to have to do much explaining about why, right? So there's a large cohort of women, as we saw in those data about people either losing their job voluntarily or involuntarily. Large cohort of women are going to have that same break in their career trajectory on their resume. And so hopefully that's going to make it less of an onus of needing to explain why I'm having to now, a year from now, on-ramp back into a career. But more broadly, my hope is that it can kind of normalize that we all have these transitions, right? In and out of our work life for a variety of reasons. And it's not such this odd duck story to have to tell anymore. The third is that, for better or worse, these boundaries between work and home collapsed, at least for a time period, for everyone. And so for a time period there, for every non-essential worker that started to work remotely from their home, they felt what it was like to have no boundaries between personal and professional. And so even if it was coerced, as this quote says, whenever we have more people experiencing the thing that we used to only say was something that working moms had to experience, that we hopefully have a greater understanding of what that looks like and why it's a struggle. We've hardly ever had a time in the recent past where competing time demands affected such a large swath, of the public at the same time. And so now, from managers to individual contributors, from folks with children to those without, we all know what it feels like to have no boundaries. And so if we can use that as a springboard for thinking about, once we are back up and running, how we can remember that in different ways and at different points, those boundaries collapse differently for all of us. And so at the end of all of these, really, I think what we're talking about with all three of these silver linings I just offered is that we've pulled back the curtain. We're having these conversations that used to be a conversation that was really thought to be a conversation around women, right? That women are the ones that need to balance, and women have that second shift. So how can we support women with more flexible work, more organizational supports? And it no longer needs to be this sort of uphill battle where an individual employee has to prove to their manager why they can do their job in a more flexible scenario, why working from home 2 days is okay. We're having these conversations in a much more open, wider fashion. And so my hope and the way that we can all be part of this is that we don't let ourselves fall back into those prior habits, that we use this as a springboard for thinking, how can we fold this into the way we work going forward in a way that isn't just, oh, let's be nice and let people work from home, actually realizing that it can be functional and improve performance for individual workers and organizations at large. So I don't love that it happened in this fashion, but I am hopeful that the things that we've been trying to prove for so long that felt like it was a story of working women are now out there as part of our normal conversation. And we can use those to fold them into the way we work going forward. And so, these are silver linings. We're not clear on if, how long, to what extent they'll realize themselves. And so what can we do in the meantime to survive so that we can still be here to be part of shepherding these signs of hope into the future work environment for men and women? And so I'm gonna use the final time here. Good, I think I'm on time. The remaining 5 or 10 minutes before we open for questions. What can you do if you're an organization or manager to kind of help employees in the meantime, women in particular, but employees at large, and also you as an individual that may be navigating a lot of what I just shared as the context that's facing us today? So the first is modeling visibility. I don't know, this is where these webinars are hard because I can't see if anybody's laughing or smiling about this clip, but if you remember, I think this was back in 2017 where this gentleman, he's a professor and he was being interviewed on the BBC about something very serious related to his expertise, and his child showed up in the background. And when this went viral a number of years ago, this was sort of a new thing. Like, wow, look, this is happening to this gentleman. I think probably every single one of us could raise our hands right now that have been working from home, that have had a similar experience, whether it's a child, a dog, a spouse. And I don't know if this characterizes your experience, but I know early on, we were all feeling like, I have a big call. I have to give a webinar. Let me make sure the kids don't come in. Let me make sure my partner knows not to talk to me during 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. And I think as we've done this longer and longer, I hope we've all realized that it actually helps to just show that. Because if I'm a manager or leader and I get interrupted by my child who's on remote learning during an important meeting, then hopefully that makes the employee, when that happens to them, not feel as much like it's such a bad thing to do. So modeling visibility, not only because we're in this crazy situation right now, but that's something that can help us more broadly. There was actually a study prior to the pandemic that showed when a CEO simply will announce to his executive team, hey, I'm leaving at 3 p.m. today to go to my child's soccer game at the high school, how much that actually shifts the family supportiveness of the culture just by the CEO making such a statement. And so we can use this time right now to recognize that we can be a good model, we can showcase that flexibility is a solution, because then that shows your own employees that, okay, if they can do that, I can do that too, and I won't be seen as any less of a good performing worker. The second thing is provide certainty to employees where possible. So we are in uncertain times, sure. But to the extent that employees can feel like there's some certainty around them, and I think a lot of the conversations right now, I actually just wrote a piece on this with a colleague around certainty around how and where and when we're going to work. So certainly, yes, we want to be able to tell our employees, okay, we've made the decision that we'll be remote till June 30th. We'll revisit it, May 30th, so you have an idea. It at least gives people kind of medium-term sense of certainty in terms of where and when we're working. But here I also mean providing certainty around performance. Be clear about job expectations right now. Be clear about how the employee is doing to help alleviate some of that stress where employees may be geographically distributed and kind of wondering, I don't even know how I'm doing these days. So we can provide certainty not only as it relates to where and how we're working because of the pandemic, but also certainty around how employees are doing. What are the expectations right now? I think that we early on had this feeling like, well, managers just need to go easy on their employees. And yes, we need to be understanding, but even during a pandemic, managers are still under pressure to deliver results. And so the longer that we're working in this context, it gets harder to have the solution just be, well, go easy on your employees. And so having those conversations around certainty of, listen, here's what your job expectations are. Here's where there's wiggle room. Here's where I'm hoping that you can do better. That's just even more important right now, given this context that we're in, that we're having those conversations. And so that's the next bit of advice I can give. Having conversations, you've all read by now, 10 months in, the power of an employee, an employer, a leader, or even a colleague asking, how are you doing, right? How are you doing? How are you hanging in there? There is some research showing that this is going to make us naturally more human at work because we've allowed each other into our homes and lives in ways that we never have before. But what I actually mean here is having those conversations that we maybe used to gloss over before. Any of you that work in corporations know that there's often this annual or biannual review process where you are supposed to have a performance review conversation with your manager, and that may result in an employee rating, and that may have impacts for salary and bonus. And oftentimes when things are great and we're really busy, we gloss over those conversations. I wish I could see hands, but how many times have you as a manager or an employee had that, hey, listen, our performance reviews are due to HR tomorrow. We're supposed to have a conversation about it, but I know we're both busy. You're doing great. Will you just sign here that we had the conversation and that we had that performance conversation, and we'll catch up with it after this busy season. And that maybe felt fine when times are good, but now is not the time to gloss over even those performance conversations. Not saying we need to be hammering our employees right now for tough, doing better in their performance, but just having those developmental conversations. What are you thinking about your career? How is it going given the pandemic? What are you hoping to continue to do? What can I do to help you? Managers can't solve everything right now, but we can't even understand what our employees need if we're not at least having those conversations. Some surveys are showing that employees felt like in March and April, they were really being supported by their organizations and their managers were being empathetic, and that over the summer months that started to dwindle. So recognize, as much as I'm saying, yes, managers are still under pressure to deliver results and we need to still have these conversations, this still isn't business as usual. And so we do still need to be checking in with employees. We do still need to be thinking about how can we use this time to improve our processes. I know somebody that when we first kicked off in March and April, their team always had like a 8:30, 9 a.m. huddle where they would talk about the day. And they were just trying to recreate that in this virtual environment. And you quickly learn that's not possible. So let's use this time to think about how do we improve our processes and maybe get rid of that, this is how we've always done it bias in organizations in ways that will not only help individual employees, but will improve the overall process for when we get back to a more normal work situation. And then lastly, a warning that one concerning thing we're seeing is that we are creating some new cultural norms in this environment, some that have to relate to sort of surveilling one another and reporting on if we see, if we are in the office, if we see employees not following the rules. And yes, safety is of concern, but we just want to make sure that we're not creating dysfunctional cultural norms during this period that might stick for the long term. So that goes for the good norms, right? So if we're creating cultural norms right now in our organization, that we actually check in with each other and see how we're doing, and that we're helpful and understanding when people have to take a break to care for family or deal with something during the workday. Yes, we want those norms to stick, but let's also realize that other norms that we might create right now that maybe are a little bit dysfunctional for our team and our organization, those might stick as well. So recognize that this isn't business as usual, but humans are habitual creatures. And so if we start different forms of interacting now that maybe aren't so functional for our team, we want to make sure those don't stick beyond the pandemic. And what can you do as an individual to advocate for yourself and others? One thing that we know some of the research shows us is that women, not because we can't do it, but we are often socialized not to ask and not to advocate in ways that men maybe are able to do in organizations because it doesn't feel as wrong. And so then they end up with better salaries and better assignments. So what can you do given that everybody's in a tough situation, but as the data shows, women disproportionately are in a tougher situation? What can you do in the meantime to advocate for yourself and others? Particularly if you're hopefully one of us that's lucky enough to still have a viable and secure job right now. So the first is ask, and then ask again. We know communication is paramount. That sounds trite right now, but right now being clear about what you need and requesting clarity from managers is more important than anything. Small adjustments can go a long way. Asking a manager, if I really have to sign in to the 9 a.m. meeting every morning, here's a proposal how I might do it differently. There's even some work out there saying, what if you are looking for a job right now during this time and you're still unsure how the childcare scenario is going to unfold or your elder care responsibilities might shift? And the best we can do, even if we're looking for new employment right now, is ask about these things, because the last thing we want to do is end ourselves up in a new position that just isn't amenable to what we're juggling. So it should be a new and important criteria to find a flexible and empathetic work environment if we have the luxury of being able to, take some time to look for that right position. The second is, it's all relative. I know this is something I have struggled with. I feel fortunate that I have a career in a supportive organization right now and a salary, and so does my spouse. I feel fortunate that my children are okay and that we'll figure this out. And so it often feels hard to complain and to say that I'm struggling when I know a lot of people have it worse than me. But I really liked this quote. It was from a recent article that was actually looking at the context facing women in employment. It says, I really struggle with the gratefulness of being in a better position than a lot of people, but acknowledging it's still very difficult. And so I'm trying to continually tell that to myself. I think it's important that we as leaders and managers tell that to our employees and to our colleagues, that we can be grateful that we might be doing okay right now. We know a lot of people aren't, but it's still okay to struggle. And so that's another bit of that point of just advocating, recognizing when we might need to take a break to just make sure that we're okay, even if we're lucky enough to have a job. Say no, but also say yes. So a lot of research out there tells us that women often have hard in an organizational context saying no, that women are disproportionately asked to be the one that takes on the event planning, that, is in charge of taking the notes during a meeting. And there's a lot of work that says, women have to get better with saying no and being able to advocate for themselves. And so now more than ever, we have to be able to say no if we cannot take on something extra, but also say yes. I have a number of colleagues and friends that I've talked to that have been offered promotions during this period. And it's scary to think about taking on more work at a context that is so dysfunctionally hard, particularly for professional women right now. But we can realize that some good can come of that. We can say yes. I personally said yes to an additional assignment in my organization that's been really helpful for me to understand what's going on and how we're managing the pandemic at our university. So recognizing that even though times are hard right now, it's still okay to say yes to something. It may be actually that boost that we need to be able to sustain ourselves through this difficult time. And then lastly, you know, we don't all have the luxury of putting up this out of office message. I saw this as a tip in a Harvard Business Review article that I just read, where somebody actually early on in the pandemic put this as their out of office message. Life is weird right now, please bear with me. We certainly don't all have the luxury of doing that, but I think this is a good example of sometimes the best we can do right now for ourselves, for our colleagues, for our employees that report to us, if we're leaders, is to just have frequent, open, honest conversations. And you never know how much that's actually going to help you. I had a couple students, but one in particular that were really struggling last semester with the virtual learning environment. And so we set up weekly calls to check in and try to keep her on track. And I was surprised, and I shared this with her, how much it actually helped me as well, that we were able to just connect as human beings, even though we're in a different sort of status position. And so it helped me professionally, it helped her. And so just recognizing life is weird right now, and sometimes it feels easier to just not talk about it, but in the context of work, having those frequent, honest conversations is probably the best, clearest, most consistent thing we can do for ourselves, for our colleagues, for our employees. And when all else fails, hang in there, right? I think we all want to see those silver linings that I offered for women's careers come about. And so if we can't hang in there and be part of it, it's going to stink if we don't get to benefit from them. So I do think over the long term, we are going to look back on this swift move to remote work and this collapsing of boundaries for everyone as a helpful thing to more broadly shifting organizational life and our expectations of work in a way that's more amenable to men and women in managing family, non-work, personal demands with work demands. And so I do think if we can hang in there, if we can kind of thread our way through this, there are some opportunities to be gained more broadly for the experience of work, for what we expect of our workers, and for largely how we think about performance and retaining and promoting individuals. And so that is what I had for today. I hope that people learned something new. I hope that people maybe felt like some of those really scary headlines were explained, and we're at a minimum that you feel some bit of hope that out of this struggle and out of these declines that we're seeing for professional women, that on the long term, it might actually be helpful for the future progress of women and work. And so with that, I am going to, as Amy instructed me, stop the recording.